And you're telling me that I don't have the right to refuse an ambulance?
A lot of people are hoping that I will comment on the situation, and I won't talk about this creator circumstance, but I do want to explain the process of emergency detention and an involuntary psych hold, because not a lot of people understand how this stuff works. So for this explanation, I want you to think about 3 pillars. One pillar is kind of going down the legal process, and then the right is going to be discharge home, and the left is going to be admit to the hospital. First scenario is an emergency detention, or an ED, people say familiarly. This is a hold for about 48 hours that can be initiated by some member of law enforcement because they're concerned about psychiatric illness. Let's say you're a police officer and you respond to a domestic dispute at a gas station. You show up and someone is talking about how they're hearing voices. They think that someone's watching them and following them. You're concerned that they may have some psychotic illness. And so because of that, you want them to be evaluated. A police officer is not a psychiatrist. You and I know that. They can't evaluate a patient and admit them to a psychiatric hospital. But if they suspect that this person has an illness that could be a danger to themselves or others, it's not good to just let them go either. So as a society, our best solution to that is to say, okay, we can hold them for 48 hours under an emergency detention until a psychiatrist can evaluate them. That is what the EMT is describing in this video. The cops filed an emergency detention.
To refuse an ambulance?
Psychiatrically evaluated at a behavioral health facility.
It's their job to transport her to an emergency department or behavioral health facility where she'll be evaluated. That's usually what my job is.
So, unfortunately,
so you're telling me that I cannot...
The police is telling you, and I'm relaying what the police have told us.
And then they go to an eval. This is going to be with a psychiatrist in the emergency department. From there, I do a full mental health assessment of the patient, and that's when the first crossroads happens. I can either decide the patient doesn't meet criteria and can go home, or the patient does meet criteria and should come into the hospital. Where we really get into trouble here is if there's not an agreed upon decision. What I mean is that if I and the patient disagree on where the patient wants to go. So there are times where I show up in the emergency department and I talk with the patient. They want to go home. They think it was a misunderstanding. I talk with them. I say, hey, I agree this was a misunderstanding. And then I call collateral and people can corroborate the story. Everything kind of makes sense. We let the dust settle. I'm like, okay. And then there are times where someone is really in a dark spot and I kind of sit with them for a moment, and they were resistant at first when they were dealing with the police, but now we kind of talk about it and they say, you know what, I want to work on my mental health. I want to come into the hospital. And I say, I think that's a good idea. And now there's no animus there either. But what happens if we disagree? Well, I've done my evaluation of them and I say, okay, this person isn't able to keep themselves safe, or they're having really disruptive psychotic hallucinations. They can't distinguish reality from their perceptual disturbances, and they're of a violent nature. Maybe they're perceiving someone's chasing them and they're going to run erratically into traffic or something like that, and I'm worried that they might get hurt or cause some kind of disruption. The patient doesn't recognize this. Now it's tough. And especially if I call their family, and their family's also been concerned about them for a long time, and there's a lot of other dangerous things that have been happening. So now I'm recommending they come into the hospital, but the patient disagrees with me. What do we do now here legally? The psychiatrist then files something called an order of protective custody. This varies by state. It can also be called a... Are y'all okay? Anyone want to explain what happened here? It can also be called an involuntary commitment. The thing about an OPC, or an order of protective custody, is that it has to be reevaluated by another psychiatrist within 24 hours. So now we have the OPC, order of protective custody, which lasts about 3 to 5 days, and we have a second psychiatrist here. This is usually business days, so if this happens on a Friday, the OPC probably won't expire until the following Friday. So now we enter a crossroads again. If the patient continuously says, hey, I want to go home, I don't think this is necessary, the second psychiatrist evaluates them and says, you know what, I agree, you can't go home. Then they could be going home the next day. Or another thing that can happen is they're in the hospital for a few days, the medication starts to be effective, and they say, hey, my hallucinations are improving. I actually want to get up to a good dose so I can tolerate this. I want to go ahead and just continue with my hospitalization. And they switch to what we call voluntary. Voluntary meaning I consent to be in the hospital at this time, departing from that order of protective custody. If we're stuck in a crossroads where the order of protective custody expires and the patient still doesn't want to be admitted, now we run into court. So you can appeal after 5 days to a judge as to why you shouldn't be in a mental health hospital, and the psychiatrist will testify as well. It's not uncommon for the judge to side with the patient and say, hey, I don't think that this is grounds to keep them in the hospital, and I think they're okay to discharge. And personally, I'm usually reassured to see the outcome of the court in the patient's favor, even though it's opposing what I think is the care team. Because it's functionally a reminder that the legal safeguards that we have in place are discharging properly to protect people's rights. And then if I was an amoral psychiatrist, I wouldn't be able to just run amok. Once the patient goes to court, the judge can decide discharge home, or the patient can decide to be voluntary. This is unlikely at this point if we're going all the way to court. So then the next step would be the result of court. And so this can be many different things. Court can ask to reevaluate the patient in a week or a certain amount of timeline, and it can also come down to saying, hey, as a part of the behaviors seen with this psychiatric illness, we compel you to take medication or things like that. I think this is where a lot of psychiatry gets really icky, and it's tough navigating this situation. If someone is so psychotic or manic that they have trouble engaging with reality, it can be really frustrating to give them medication. And also when you see them recover from their psychotic illness with the medication, it's reassuring to see them gain insight and say that they're glad that they got to that position. When someone is having a psychotic break, the way we think about it in the legal system is almost like if you're unconscious. And we take this paternalistic approach to return them to their ordinary state of mind. That is so much easier said in theory than its execution turns out, and it turns into a lot of icky situations. To be honest, this is my least favorite part of psychiatry. I hate ever restricting someone's rights, and I take a lot of pride in being able to safely evaluate someone and come up with a plan that they can leave the hospital if they don't want to be there. And also, I understand that there are some illnesses and disorders that are so dangerous that we need to address them as a society, and the system is set up to do that while it does it fallibly.